This winter break, I had the privilege of attending Costa Rica with Hood College. During this trip, I immersed myself in a new culture, visited local coffee farms, and learned about their significance. Costa Rica is a country located in Central America. Its capital is San Jose. The origins and history of coffee cultivation in Costa Rica have led to this process known as ecotourism, which is what I'm going to be unearthing today. But let me first start by just talking about my experience in Costa Rica. I attended an indigenous community visit with people who preserve their own culture and language. While Spanish is the official language in Costa Rica, they spoke a language known as Bribri from the Bribri tribe. And I learned that there are many indigenous populations in Costa Rica. I also played soccer with locals, unearthed new traditions by making chocolate from hand, and I also learned about Afro-Caribbean culture. Afro-Caribbean culture is extremely prominent in the Caribbean coast. It's a culture that influences food and language, and I learned this through a Caribbean cooking class. These experiences were deeply enriching, and they also exposed me to the complexities of Costa Rica's modernization and its reliance on ecotourism. So this trip was exceptionally memorable, but today I'm going to be unearthing Costa Rica, specifically the impact of ecotourism. Ecotourism, while it has had an immense positive impact on Costa Rica by increasing jobs and increasing educational awareness, it has also had an immense negative impact. It has led to social and economic inequality and also loss of cultural identity. Now, I want to take a deeper look at the impact of ecotourism in Costa Rica. For starters, ecotourism is often it's a sustainable way to connect people with nature, but also with tourism, and it allows individuals to experience wildlife and the local culture, while also it contributes to the conservation of natural resources and supporting local economies. The idea is essentially that through responsible travel, tourists can help protect the environment and improve the livelihoods of local communities. And on the surface, this sounds like a perfect solution for a country rich in biodiversity like Costa Rica, which is home to 5% of the Earth's biodiversity. Now, that being said, prior to the 1800s, Costa Rica has been extremely dependent upon coffee. Its entire economic infrastructure was built on coffee. However, while this initially was a good idea, it wasn't very stable. So Costa Rica needed a better solution, and this was ecotourism. And so while it undeniably had positive effects, it created jobs in areas such as tour guiding and hospitality. It also contributed to an immense economic divide in the country. So the increase in tourism has raised the cost of living in areas close to popular tourist destinations. So while individuals are benefiting as ecotourism is creating an influx of jobs, a lot of the local citizens of Costa Rica are actually harmed by ecotourism as they live next to these really populated tourist spots. The cost of living increases significantly, and this leads to a wide wealth gap. And so this means that locals who do not work directly in the tourism industry often find themselves struggling to afford the rising prices of goods and services. And according to research, this causes social stratification, which is a process that divides social classes. So like tour guides, hotel workers, and restaurant employees, they're benefiting from the influx of visitors. This leads to a noticeable stratification of social classes, with wealthy tourism operators and workers on one side and poorer locals where the poverty rates are increasing, who do not directly profit from ecotourism. And what's also worse is the gender gap is emerging as a result of this economic divide, which speaks to the social issues that ecotourism is causing in Costa Rica. In Costa Rica, tour guides and tourism is exceptionally a male-dominated field. So women in particular are often the ones left behind. They're working in informal sectors or as domestic workers, while the men tend to dominate the more visible and higher paying positions in the tourism industry. And so this disparity contributes to a cycle of social inequality that is difficult to break. So not only does ecotourism contribute to economic inequality, but also social inequality. But the consequences of ecotourism, they don't just stop at social and economic inequality. One of the most concerning issues is the impact on cultural identity. While ecotourism contributes to increasing awareness of different cultures, Costa Rica is home to several indigenous communities with its own language. As I stated before, we went to see the Bribri tribe, for example, and it was an honor for me to visit this during my trip. However, as ecotourism has increased in Costa Rica, it has introduced outside influences that are threatening the essence of these cultures. For instance, while tourists are allowed to visit indigenous communities and experience their way of life, this often leads to a commercialization of culture. When we were talking to the indigenous community, they said a lot of the times they were forced to assimilate and acclimate to the experience of tourists. Tourists expect a certain thing, so they put on this performance. So essentially the problems arise when indigenous communities feel pressured to modify their practices in order to meet their expectations of tourists. And this leads to a loss of cultural authenticity. For instance, while some indigenous communities may have traditional dances or rituals they make this more marketable or appealing to visitors because of this expectation, due to the immense presence of ecotourism in Costa Rica because the economy is dependent on it. And so what once could have been a sacred practice for these indigenous communities, it often becomes a performance for outsiders, and this diminishes the cultural significance of these indigenous traditions. Also, in addition to the commercialization of culture, the influx of foreign influence is evident in other ways. During my visit, I saw American chain restaurants like KFC and McDonald's in popular tourist areas, but also throughout the country. And so these restaurants are displacing local cuisine, and they're contributing to the erosion of Costa Rican food traditions. As American businesses continue to expand, they bring with them a negative effect that threatens the diversity of local culture and foodways. On this trip, we went to restaurants with local Costa Rican cuisine. However, it's important to note that ecotourism contributes to the loss of cultural identity as American chain restaurants are being built and more of them are being built. Also, the increase in ecotourism in Costa Rica has led to the displacement of indigenous communities. So in Costa Rica, many indigenous groups have lived on their ancestral land for centuries. They have a connection to the land. However, as ecotourism grows in the country, there's an increasing demand for infrastructure improvements, such as roads, hotels, and other amenities to cater to tourists, which often leads to individuals, the government, displacing indigenous territories, and this results them to be forced to relocated. And as these groups are displaced from their traditional lands, they lose not only their homes, but also their connection to the land and also the biodiversity it supports. So while ecotourism also has negative impacts economically, socially, and culturally, environmentally, it is a huge aspect, as many of these, as I said before, 5% of Costa Rica's biodiversity, Costa Rica holds 5% of the world's biodiversity. And so a lot of these animals, unfortunately, are being displaced from their homes. And so the loss of biodiversity is critical in Costa Rica, as the country is known for its ecosystems, rainforests, cloud forests, coastal wetlands. We visited volcanoes, waterfalls, but the rise of ecotourism has led to environmental degradation in some of these areas because of the construction of roads, hotels, and other infrastructure to accommodate these tourists. So not only has it led to a loss of the indigenous communities from their homes, but also deforestation, habitat loss, and pollution. And so while ecotourism has boosted Costa Rican's economy, it's important to acknowledge the negative impacts on social inequality, loss of cultural identity, the economic impacts, and also the environmental impacts. And so the country has made strides in creating a sustainable tourism industry. But with ecotourism, this must have changed to truly benefit all individuals of the population. And to ensure that ecotourism remains a positive force in Costa Rica, it has to be managed in a way that addresses the economic disparities between tourism workers and non-tourism workers, and also must protect and preserve the cultural practice of indigenous communities. One solution that I would propose is to promote responsible tourism that supports local businesses, especially those that may not specifically benefit from ecotourism. So, for instance, travelers can prioritize staying in locally owned accommodations, dining in family-owned restaurants, purchasing local crafts from different shops. And also, there has to be a concentrated effort to showcase indigenous cultures in an authentic and respectful way without exploiting or profiting off of their traditions. And so this means allowing indigenous communities to share their stories in terms and ensuring that tourists are educated about the complexities of local cultures before visiting. And also, we must focus on environmental sustainability. As ecotourism in Costa Rica grows, the government and businesses should work together to ensure that ecotourism infrastructure, is developed in a way that minimizes the environmental impact. So this can include investing in more renewable energy programs, waste management, eco-friendly accommodations that don't threaten the biodiversity that makes Costa Rica so unique. So in conclusion, this trip was extremely educational, and today I wanted to unearth ecotourism in Costa Rica. And so while it has the potential to bring immense positive change in Costa Rica economically by creating an influx of jobs and also increasing awareness, we have to recognize and address its negative impacts. And so by supporting local businesses, respecting cultural identities, and fostering sustainable developmental practices, we can ensure that the ecotourism benefits everyone in Costa Rica and preserves the country's rich heritage for future generations. Thank you. These are my references.